on the wave gradient?
Questions, I'll have like section breaks, and that would probably be the best time.
So on the internet, if you have a question, just write it in the chat, then I can read them for you, or raise your hand and I will call your name so you can ask.
Okay. So laminar turbulent transition. Between the introduction and conclusion, we'll be talking about the physical mechanisms that contribute to transition, amplifying some initial disturbance in the free stream up to what would cause transition. We'll quantify that growth of that initial disturbance to some extent. And then we'll describe a couple of methods for predicting when that growth, when that wave has reached a sufficient amplitude to actually initiate transition. So those are the three topics. And first, in the introduction, I'd like to tell you that we're focusing specifically on boundary layer transition on flight vehicles, so not shear layers, unfortunately. But this is just what we'll be focusing on for now, but there's a lot of transferability. I'm going to focus as much as I can on the physics of the problem, because the mathematics are verbose and a little overly complicated for something like this. So I'll put some of the math, but not very much of it. And all of these graphics are shamelessly stolen without attribution. I obviously did not make them. So there you go. The first thing I want to tell you is that transition is important. The NASA program, National Aerospace Plane, people were trying to figure out how do we actually make something go hypersonic for the first time, first major program. And the big takeaway is that transition affects the takeoff weight, because transition affects your drag and transition affects your heat flux. If you have a turbulent boundary layer, it's going to have a lot more heat flux, a lot more drag. And so it can affect in terms of the heat shield that you need and the thermal protection system, you're going to affect your gross takeoff weight by a factor of 2 or more. So predicting transition is very important so that you don't underpredict or overpredict the amount of thermal protection that you need. The second point, in addition to transition being important, is that transition is hard. According to this paper from 2010, they surveyed as many NASA vehicles as they could, and they found that everyone used essentially an empirical correlation of Reynolds over Mach to determine where transition would occur on their vehicle. And it turns out that transition is a whole heck of a lot more complicated than Reynolds number over Mach number, but it's so difficult to predict accurately, and even our best methods have their own challenges. And so pretty much every single NASA entry vehicle has used an empirical boundary layer transition prediction approach, which shows you how far we are away from getting something useful in terms of reliable, rigorous predictions. And it also shows that design engineers need something that is simple, that works quickly to iterate in that process.
Just to fix something on Zoom.
Oh, sure. Give it a second.
No, go for it.
Oh, okay. I'll cool. Are you good?
No, I just okay.
Okay, cool. I will make you a co-host. Yeah. So that's the introduction. Transition is important, and transition is hard. Now let's talk about the physics of what happens in transition. So this is an oversimplified example of transition on a flat plate. So when you're thinking about a flat plate, you're going to start with some initial stable, purely laminar flow. But this flow isn't really perfectly laminar. There's going to be always some kind of instability, some kind of oscillation that you can't really perfectly make this thing exactly laminar. And that is going to lead into some two-dimensional unsteadiness. This problem, it was initially thought that transition happened kind of all at once. It goes straight from this nice laminar flow to a three-dimensional turbulent boundary layer. But that's actually not the case in this example, because well, I don't know, I can't explain the because, but I can say that it does happen, that it starts with these two-dimensional Thomine-Schlichting waves that will then rapidly grow into three-dimensionality. And after this three-dimensionality emerges, there are these things called primary modes, primary instabilities, that take things from the Thomine-Schlichting waves and amplify these initial disturbances that come in from our free stream, that will amplify them to the point where we develop some localized points, these turbulent spots that will transition into turbulence. And these turbulent spots will then entrain the rest of the laminar flow, the flow that hasn't fully developed into transition, will entrain that flow into a turbulent flow in the downstream of those turbulent spots. So that's just to say that transition is not something that just happens at a point on your plate. It's not something that happens at a point on your vehicle, but it's something that takes some procedures, some processes to really emerge. And just as a visualization, this is a bunch of gray dots on a black and white photo, which is very exciting. But these are the visualization of those turbulent spots in a water channel. And it's kind of exciting to see that you can really see those localized, highly localized behaviors with just a few aluminum flakes, which is very interesting. So how does transition happen? Here's a somewhat complicated chart. We start from the top and we go down. And at the top, we have some external disturbances. Let's say that someone is waving their arms around in the wind, or there's some weather phenomenon, and this is going to produce some oscillations in your free stream. And the things that are important to note about your free stream, well, if you assume that it's just a wave that's traveling at your vehicle, we want to know how big is that oscillation that's coming at us? How fast is it? What's the frequency? And what's the angle? Where is it coming from on our geometry? If we have some non-symmetrical geometry, for instance, all of these things are going to affect the transition. After we know what our disturbance is, we've characterized our disturbance, we want to know how it gets into the boundary layer, because the boundary layer is going to be the thing that's transitioning, obviously. It's important to think about whether or not that disturbance will be immediately attenuated, or it will be amplified by the boundary layer. So how does it get into the boundary layer? Will it stay there? And then after that, we talked about primary modes. I mentioned them briefly. Primary modes, after we get to receptivity, the most common thing is that these primary modes will amplify your initial disturbance and help it to grow up to where it can become interesting. It can affect the free stream in some tangible way. And after this starts to affect the free stream, primary modes go into secondary mechanisms. Secondary mechanisms are what take us from affecting the free stream to actual turbulence. And they're complicated and I can't explain them, so we're not going to be discussing them that much because they're very high frequency and very short in time. So mostly in this talk, I'm going to be talking about the primary modes, the thing that really help us grow the wave. And I'll mention all of these other things right now. These are just some of the physical mechanisms of why transition happens. So first, with receptivity, we have some incident acoustic waves that are coming at our hypersonic flat plate, whatever, and they're going to pass through this shock wave, generally speaking. So they're going to be compressed because shock waves, things are very high pressure and high temperature, and they have to slow down a lot. And that means that your waves, that your frequency, whatever it is in the free stream, is going to get a lot higher after going through the shock. So you have some initial amplitude and some initial frequency. You have a higher frequency and perhaps a higher amplitude after passing through the shock. Then this means that even some low amplitude free stream, low frequency free stream disturbances can generate noisy and potentially turbulent post-shock conditions, which is interesting and potentially bad if we don't account for this. In terms of what frequencies are actually going to be amplified, there are a variety of things that can amplify frequencies. But the simplest thing that can amplify a frequency is resonance with the boundary layer. And so after we have our free stream disturbance that goes to our shock interaction, it gets perhaps a higher amplitude, it gets a higher frequency, it travels into the boundary layer. And then after it gets into the boundary layer, what can happen is if the wavelength is double the boundary layer height, then, or some multiple of the boundary layer height, then the wave will be forced at the base and at the top. And I should have included a picture that shows the pressure distribution at a boundary layer, but there's typically some higher pressures at the edge of a boundary layer. And then obviously you have the body at the bottom that's traveling forward. And so when a wave is being forced at both the edge of the boundary layer and at the vehicle surface, then something that is twice the wave, that has a wavelength of twice the boundary layer height, will be amplified, will be in resonance with this system. The thing is that the boundary layer height is not constant. It changes across your vehicle. And so the most attenuated and most amplified wavelengths will change as the boundary layer grows. So at each point on this surface, there is an amplification factor for how, and a growth rate, for how much this particular phenomenon is going to grow or decay for a particular wave. And some people call these modes that are, these wavelengths that are amplified at this location, Mach modes. But the terminology is confusing and ill-defined in literature, so you can call it whatever you want. The second thing to think about with Mach modes, at each, the figure I showed you previously kind of described which frequencies would be most amplified at a particular point. But there are lots of different frequencies. And for each frequency, we can create a plot that looks like this, where on the top, we have the growth rate. If it's above 0, then it is growing. And if it's below 0, then it's decaying. And on the bottom, we have the real part of the phase speed that is non-dimensionalized. So this is essentially the free stream speed, which is going to be the velocity, the free stream velocity, plus the speed of sound in that medium. Because if you are moving downstream, you can consider the Doppler effect, where if you ping something, something is going to move downstream at u plus c infinity, which is the essentially the speed of sound, and something at u minus c infinity, because that wave will want to propagate in both directions when you kind of ping something. And so these are the two speeds that are very of interest for this particular problem, u plus the speed of sound and u minus the speed of sound. And things that come in at these speeds are typically called the slow and the fast modes. And there are a lot of fast modes because the free stream is kind of all along the outside of the boundary layer. And frequencies will cut in, is the term. These fast modes will cut in from the top here and become part of our problem. I can't explain this very well, but you just need to know that they cut in at some point. And when the frequencies of these slow and fast modes align, you get something called a synchronism right here, and then further on down, where the black line kind of gets to the same slope and point as one of the fast modes. And you can see at all of these points where we have a synchronism, then the waves, the slow and the fast modes, those waves will exchange energy. And one will become amplified and one will become attenuated at that phase. So here, when we have a synchronism between the first fast mode and the slow mode, we have that the slow mode gets a lot of energy and this growth rate becomes positive. So something will grow here. And this growth rate becomes much more negative. So it will decay a lot faster there. There are an infinite number of fast modes. I can't explain this very well, so I apologize. But essentially, for each frequency, we can generate a plot that looks like this for each incoming wave packet. And the wave packets that are most amplified and most attenuated, well, one of the ways that they can be thought of is with this. So the most amplified and most attenuated waves at a particular point will be determined by kind of the resonance with the system. And for each one of those, we have slow and fast modes that will interact and lead to growth or decay of a particular wave. And this is the simplest and most fundamental primary mode. It's simple enough that I can understand it to some degree and explain it. The rest of them I will not be explaining to this degree. So this is Mach modes, synchronisms between waves, waves exchange energy, and we get a growth rate, positive growth rate. Another primary mode, another thing to think about that will increase the amplitude of a wave is a Gortler vortex, which occurs whenever we have concavity on a surface. If we have concavity, then when the radius of curvature of the concavity is on the same scale as the boundary layer thickness, there is going to be a centripetal force that is going to push things up. That's going to push this slow moving stuff from near the base of the boundary layer up, and create these kind of asymmetrical or non-uniform distribution of upward and downward velocities that are going to form these Gortler vortices. So if the free stream is coming in this way, we're going to see vortices kind of normal to that direction. And this generates turbulence, and this causes amplification of waves in a way that I don't fully understand, but they do it, and that's good enough for now. The last one is a three-dimensional cross-flow instability. Cross-flow vortices are co-rotating vortices that are aligned with the flow direction. In the top figure, we have Tolmien-Schlichting waves. So these are the two-dimensional waves that I was talking about earlier. A laminar boundary layer decays, I forget the appropriate word. Tolmien-Schlichting waves emerge from this laminar boundary layer, and through some magical processes will turn into a turbulent boundary layer. In this case, what happens if we have cross-flow vortices instead? These vortices that are aligned with the flow due to some cross-flow that is coming across our surface. They'll generate vortices on the surface. This can also lead to turbulence in the same way that the Gortler vortices do. These vortices can travel, meaning that it starts here, but it can move up and down the plate depending on the velocities involved and fluctuations in the free stream. They're not very susceptible to these perturbations, but they do travel, which is strange. And they're involved in transient growth. So right now I've been talking about primary modes, but there's also something called transient growth that happens at slightly higher energies that I, again, cannot fully explain, but vortices are involved. So this is one of the modes that will, or one of the mechanisms by which transition emerges from an otherwise laminar flow. So in summary of these primary modes, we talked about three primary modes: the Mach modes with the slow and the fast modes and the resonance between them. Talked about Gortler vortices and 3D crossflow instabilities that are often less discussed because Mach modes, when you consider a hypersonic vehicle above Mach 3 or so, going into a perfectly laminar free stream pointed straight at the vehicle, Mach second mode is going to dominate. And people like this simple problem of a Mach 3 cone or a Mach 3 plus cone going into a perfectly laminar flow. And so people talk about Mach modes a lot, specifically Mach second mode. They don't talk about Gortler vortices and 3D crossflow instabilities because those are hard and we don't like them because they're hard. So they're not discussed, but they're very important because all types of instability generating mechanisms can exist simultaneously in a flow, and they can interact with each other and share energy between these different waves and different types of structures that are going on. They can share energy across them, and this makes the problem very complicated. So these things are less discussed because they're complicated, but they are important because they happen on real flight vehicles. Other types of primary instabilities exist, but I don't know about them, or they're too complicated for me to understand. And I think I've covered this slide. The last thing I'll talk about here is bypass transition, which was on the bottom right of that kind of flow chart I showed earlier. This is a J58 Pratt & Whitney, and then an RL10 turbopump. And this is just to say that whenever there's turbo machinery, whenever there's extremely high amplitude oscillations, such as if there's combustion, if there's a turbo fan that's spinning really fast, this is obviously going to generate some turbulence in your flow. And you do not need to go through Tollmin-Schlichting waves or Gortler vortices or anything. Turbulence will just emerge if your environment is extremely energetic and noisy. So the things that we're talking about are generally predicting transition in boundary layers that are a little calmer, such as over the surface of a wing or over some vehicle. And turbulence in these sorts of environments kind of just happens and is assumed. So in summary, we talked about the steps for transition on a flat plate, starting from a laminar flow through the Tollmin-Schlichting waves, and then through to the turbulent spots that entrain the rest of the flow. We talked about a couple of different pathways for transition, depending on the energy of your system and your free stream and your disturbances. You can get primary modes or you can get transient growth, which I didn't talk about, but that's okay. Receptivity and shock waves is a topic of interest. Primary modes are the things that really amplify an initial wave packet, and bypass transition kind of just happens. After these things happen, at some amplification level, we will transition, and that's breakdown. So once it gets big enough, the amplification will meaningfully affect the free stream or the boundary layer flow beyond just some small oscillations, and that's when we get the transition to turbulence really going. Questions? Alex?
So with the macros, those are all single frequency disturbances that occur. Have you given any thought to multimodal disturbances? So when you have multiple frequencies interacting, creating positive interference?
No. Yeah, that happens, and I am not advanced enough to think about it. I don't know what else. This is a diagram for a single frequency, right. And then we have lots of them that interact somehow that I don't understand.
You can have you can end up with positive wave interference and start getting packets, shapes of amplification where when the frequencies align, you start getting very extreme disturbances, but then they will damp out, so you get like a oscillating pattern.
Yeah, like a beat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For the purpose of recording, you read the question when they ask, otherwise they will.
Oh, yeah.
It's okay.
Sure.
For that.
I'll try to be louder.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
No.
Oh, sure. I think in slide 8, I was kind of curious because you mentioned turbulent spots.
Yep.
So are they stationary or do they tend to move?
I would guess that they would move because the emergence of turbulent spots is sort of random where they emerge on this plate, so they can emerge at different points. So if we go to this picture, I would imagine that if you showed a movie, it would kind of show bubbling a little bit, something that looks like turbulent spots emerging in the same sort of place, but not always in exactly the same place.
Okay, I guess yeah, I was gonna say, like, do they have a net velocity, I guess? Oh, they do.
Oh. More you know.
So with all the stuff with Mac modes, would that be kind of broadly all the stuff is that kind of the stuff that you can sort of use some linear stability ideas to analyze? Because I'm guessing just based on the ideas of like waves interfering and whatnot, those sound sort of like acoustic disturbances.
Yeah, I think Pramod can talk to this better than I can, but yes, Mach modes are typically what people look at with linear stability theory.
Okay, so that would be the sort of thing where, somebody might use like an n factor plot.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So in your understanding, the Mach modes are what are responsible for putting energy into these modes until you get to like the TS waves, and then subsequent breakdown is not part of the Mach mode.
Mach modes happen here, I think.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So they're
Right in
they're
here.
what eventually leads to your TS waves appearing, and then because your TS waves are unstable and get the breakdown. So the Mach modes.
No,
Go ahead.
you don't see TS waves like Hypersonic mode.
What?
Those are different mechanisms.
Oh.
So the Mach mode that you're talking about, those are important for high speed flow. So these are acoustic waves that, they're really unsteady for active flow.
So the Mach
You
modes
see
are,
only 50 waves and those speeds. Here's the classical flow, low subsonic flows.
so they're separate.
They exist everywhere, but these guys tend to dominate those people. Mach or tend to dominate high speed flows and the dominant the system.
So you can have breakdown to turbulence with Mach modes, but not seeing any common like the rest of them.
You could see either of them if you do some insanely careful experiment, maybe where you suppress all acoustic waves. You'll still see, that plot that you showed at some point, that little plot. What he called first mode is acoustic.
Oh,
The second mode is
so
acoustic.
so that little
And see the little plot?
in
That's
S1.
dominate if you suppress all acoustic waves.
okay.
For those on the Zoom, essentially Pramod said that the first mode on this plot on the top corresponds with the Tolmien-Schlichting waves.
I think so.
And
I don't write that. This is from somebody's thesis.
this is from, Neil Bitter.
Notation again is all over the place in general. It's a very difficult topic because of that.
Mhm.
But yeah,
Yeah. Second mode is an acoustic mode for,
I think so.
okay. Well, thank you. That's the section for the physics of transition. If there's not any other questions, I think we'll move to the next section on quantifying growth. So how do we predict growth rates? Well, there are some standardized steps for predicting growth rate, at least with linear stability theory, that people have written in textbooks for whatever that's worth. And the first one is to obtain some base flow that is laminar. We separate our equations into disturbance and base flow components. We subtract out the base flow from our equations. We linearize by assuming small disturbances. This is the fundamental assumption of linear stability theory, where P naught is much greater than P prime. We make some simplifying assumptions about the nature of our problem. We solve the problem for our spatial and temporal growth rates, and we examine these growth rates and plot regions of stability within the spatial growth rates and the spatial and temporal growth rate plane. These are neutral curves. So how do we predict them? There are many methods from linear stability theory, which is 1D wall normal approach, where we look at the growth rate at each point separate from any other point. And we just do a wall normal analysis of what that growth rate would be based on the boundary layer. We can look at a 2D approach where we can have some variation in the streamwise direction in addition to the wall normal direction. We can incorporate that into our calculations. Then it gets subsequently more complex with biglobal, which is a two-dimensional wall normal problem. Similarly, planar PSE, and then input-output DNS. And these are all just small disturbance approximations with different formulations of how we can write our, I believe it's our ansatz, our assumption, our assumed form for, I thought it was the velocity. I can't remember. I'll say it in a minute. So LST utilizes the parallel flow approximation, where we say that the mean flow only varies in the wall normal direction. There's no flow variation in the streamwise direction or the spanwise direction. It's only the wall normal direction for most of the quantities of interest. And so we assume, oh, sorry, it's not velocity, it's Q. No, it is the velocity. Q is the velocity, the wall normal velocity. We assume that the wall normal velocity in general has this form where we have the wall normal variation, and then all of the perturbations are wrapped up in this e to the I term with some dependence on the wave numbers, alpha and beta, and then the frequency omega. So we have those streamwise and spanwise wave numbers. And with this assumption of the form, with this ansatz, we make a lot of assumptions with the Navier-Stokes equations. We linearize them using the method of small perturbations. And we eventually can arrive at this equation where V and Q are the same thing. This is Q hat is just the amplitude, and Q prime is the wall normal velocity. Then we have this equation, which we can solve numerically, which allows us to find our wave numbers, alpha, and our wall normal velocity, v, and how that varies in space. This is the simplest method. Beyond that, linear stability theory, the most fundamental one, we have the parabolized stability equations, which are now weakly non-parallel, meaning that the mean flow and wave number, we can take into account variations in the x direction, computing quantities at 1x, and then marching along a line downstream and calculating wave numbers and wall normal velocities at each point in succession. And we can account for now some nonlinear effects. We have a new assumed form for the wall normal velocity. And the reason it's called parabolized stability equations is that the modified governing equations, I showed you the Orr-Sommerfeld last time. This time I'm not showing you because it's long. The modified equations become a parabolic set of ODEs, PDEs, can't remember. It's a parabolic set of differential equations. After that, you have increasingly more complex methods. Biglobal and planar PSE are kind of like linear stability theory and parabolized stability equations, but you add one extra dimension. And your shape function Q hat, that amplitude function, which initially was just a function of y, now it varies in the YZ plane. And if the cone here is our bluff body that we're simulating transition on, we're going to march each plane. So we're going to do plane 1, plane 2, plane 3, and we're going to compute quantities at each of these planes instead of just in one wall normal direction. Beyond that, there are more methods, obviously. But in terms of analytical methods, they get more and more difficult. Input-output methods are essentially a black box that we can use to take in our base flow computations and our experimental or derived perturbation data somehow. And we can derive some model to capture the system dynamics that is beneficial, but black boxes are black boxes. And that's about all I'm going to say there, because this is not an area I have a ton of expertise in. Beyond that, the gold standards is obviously forced DNS, where first we obtain a DNS of the base flow. We'll add some small amplitude unsteady forcing. Remember at the start when I said that for our initial disturbances, we were interested in the amplitude, the frequency, and the location, what angle they're coming into our body at. Coming in up here or down over here is very different from coming in straight on the nose for bold. And so where you put your disturbances in your DNS is something that requires a deep understanding of the appropriate input forcing, what modes your geometry is most sensitive to. And when done well, it delivers the best results, but it is very difficult to do this thoroughly and rigorously with limited computational power. So this is quantifying growth. We talked about the foundations of linear stability methods, of some increasingly complicated methods for computing essentially the wave numbers and the growth rates of our problem. In general, these are prohibitively expensive and have never been used in any real vehicle program because they are expensive. And it requires a lot of understanding from very expert people to use these methods accurately. So instead, everyone uses Reynolds over Mach number and experimental correlations and calls it a day. So to summarize, the last 10 slides have never been used. Finally, predicting transition. How do we predict that something will actually transition after we've had the growth rates and we've had some initial unsteady disturbance growth in our boundary layer? Well, the N factor method is obviously everyone's favorite method. And what we do is we integrate a spatial growth rate that we calculate at each point on our surface to obtain the lowercase n versus the amplification factor lowercase n versus x for that frequency, where you can see that equation here. I think I got that equation slightly wrong, but that's okay. And then you take the maximum envelope of all of the n factor curves, because you have one kind of amplification path for each frequency. You take the maximum envelope for every frequency and you get your capital N factor curve. And people can do this numerically or experimentally. You can do it numerically with any of the methods we discussed above. And this number is typically around 8 to 9 in wind tunnels, is typically around 15 to 20 in flight. Wind tunnels are not the greatest thing in the world for predicting transition because they are very different in terms of the free stream environment. But we'll talk about that more in a moment. It's called e to the n method because e to the n is equal to the amplification of your initial wave. If a is the amplitude, a over a naught is your amplification. Problems with the n factor: it doesn't account for any sort of receptivity or interactions between modes. Most people only consider max second mode. It only accounts for one pathway to transition, and you saw that complicated flow chart where there are lots of pathways to transition. Normally, this is found using quiet tunnel data, which is a quiet wind tunnel that's meant to mimic flight conditions more accurately. But they are expensive, they're time consuming, and ultimately they're not really that close to flight conditions. If you'll see this plot, the oval here is flight data. This is conventional wind tunnel data. So in terms of the Reynolds number per meter, that's just the speed essentially. And this is the Reynolds number of transition for a specific body that Steve Schneider published. You can see that these don't really match up. And if you do a quiet tunnel run in the quiet mode, it only starts to approach the correct transition Reynolds number for a couple of locations. So this is not the greatest approach in the world, and it has a lot of issues and kinks to be worked out before we can actually do something useful with this data. Alternatives include perhaps thinking about interacting n factors between different modes, input-output methods, and forced DNS. But at the end of the day, this is Graham's paper to write and not mine. So that was transition. According to Steve Schneider, who runs the Quiet Tunnels, DNS and PSE have advanced the theoretical numerical work far ahead of the experimental database, meaning that experimental work for transition has faced a lot of roadblocks in terms of being useful or accurate in any sort of a real world flight setting. But maybe with the various flight programs, hypersonics programs that are on right now, as well as progress in reduced error modeling, and these numerical methods will probably be used for their first flight campaign sometime in the near future. So maybe we'll actually use some of this information we've developed for something real. And thanks for Luke, and thanks for money. And that's the talk.
Very nice, Barry.
Yeah,
Thanks.
very nice.
3 minutes for questions.
Should quit selling yourself short. You're the one who did all the reading and research on this, so you know more than we do sitting around. So.
That's fair. Yep, there.
Oh, yeah, so the forced DNS, are you just forcing like one type of perturbation, or you just have a whole bunch of like sensors everywhere and you're just blasting like a range of like perturbation?
So what Alex said about the wave packet, you generally send a wave packet of a bunch of different amplitudes and frequencies at a body in your DNS. So you test for all of those, and you try to make that wave packet as similar to what your free stream disturbances will look like in flight as possible.
Oh, good.
I think I remember, did Zach mention though using white noise overall, like after you get your environment, you kind of just broadband, just put a bunch of frequencies in there?
I'm not familiar. Alex might be able to tell you more than I can about forced DNS, but
I mean, with forced DNS, as far as I know, I never did it when I was doing stability stuff, but it's basically just what you're saying. You're taking some sort of conditions, either they'll do measured conditions from wind tunnels, or like with weather balloons, they'll send sensors up and record atmospheric conditions, and then from there they'll generate a noise profile that you can then put as your input or inflow condition to a direct DNS simulation, which still has issues because you have to make sure whatever DNS modeler you're using can accurately transfer or can accurately pass the disturbances through the shock wave to the post-shock region, and then the boundary layer receptivity is much more well established.
It's noon. I'm trying to keep it.
congrats.
So we can all leave as
Thanks,
a
Ruben.
kind of day.
Yeah, yeah.
But I did have a question. for
Yep.
you. That's a little more how you went about this, is because this is like a whole other topic for you, right?
Yeah.
How did you what was your process for your literature search? Did you use like one of those like
Lit
trees?
maps.
Yeah. Did you like just go to lit maps and put like boundary layer stability? and
Yeah.
stuff like that.
Yep. And I think I got 2 paper recommendations from Graham, and beyond that, I was